A hand raised with a knife. A king wounded, not dead. A nation humiliated. They captured him within minutes, but they did not kill him. Not yet. They kept him breathing, so they could make him scream. What followed was not an execution. It was a demonstration. Flesh torn with red-hot pincers, boiling oil, melted lead, and burning wax poured into his wounds. Then, his limbs tied to horses. And still, he would not die. The crowd begged for it to stop. Some fainted, some vomited, but the horses kept pulling. This was not justice. This was France breaking a man until nothing human remained. He was not born to be remembered. Robert-François Damiens came into the world in 1715, the same year Louis XIV died. He was born in Arras, a northern town of cobbled streets and heavy skies. His family was working class. No title, no land, just labor and hunger. He was educated by Jesuits, but discipline did not turn him devout. He drifted from job to job, usually in service. He cleaned, he carried, he served. Sometimes he drank too much. Sometimes he spoke too loudly. Employers called him erratic, angry, unreliable, but never dangerous. He was dismissed more than once for speaking against priests. Not with fire or revolution, just small complaints, hypocrisy, greed, the kind of things most people muttered and forgot. But Damiens did not forget. He believed the world was rotting from the inside, that the powerful had poisoned the air, that the king's court, the priests, the nobles, all of them, had turned away from God. France was breaking and no one cared. He was not a man of ideology. He did not belong to any underground movement. He was not a Jacobin or a soldier. He did not write manifestos or lead secret meetings. He was just a servant, with calloused hands and a deep resentment carved into his bones. In the years before the crime, he wandered through a string of meaningless jobs. He worked for magistrates, clerks, merchants. He watched them cheat and steal and smile through it all. He started to talk more. He told people the country had lost its soul, that France needed punishment. Not change, punishment. He said the king had allowed the Jesuits to be expelled. He said the monarchy had allowed blasphemy to infect the law. He said someone had to make an example. The words grew sharper. The thoughts turned darker. He did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a tool, a warning. And slowly, quietly, the idea took root. He would not write a letter. He would not start a fire. He would walk up to the most powerful man in France, and he would draw blood. Not to kill, but to wake the country up. He had no allies, no plan of escape, no real weapon. Just a small knife and a conviction that the king had betrayed heaven. So he followed him, waited for the right moment, and when he found it, he struck. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. By the mid-1700s, the Kingdom of France was decaying behind gold-plated doors. Louis XV ruled from Versailles, a palace of mirrors and marble, far removed from the mud and hunger of his people. The court danced, drank, and whispered in silks, while the rest of the country clawed for scraps. Taxes crushed the poor, yet nobles paid none. The church feasted, yet preached sacrifice. Officials bathed in luxury, yet demanded obedience. The illusion of divine order remained, but the people could see through it. The king was called Louis the Beloved, but on the streets of Paris, they said it with bitterness. In Paris, children died of cold. Bread costs more than a day's labor. Farmers abandoned their land. The clergy told them to pray harder, and Louis? He was busy with mistresses. He passed reforms, then retracted them. He listened to advisors, then ignored them. He weakened the parlements. He expelled the Jesuits. That last act struck something deep. The Jesuits had been powerful, educated, feared. To their supporters, they were the backbone of faith. To their enemies, they were political poison. But when Louis allowed their expulsion in 1764, many believed it signaled France's complete moral collapse. To men like Damiens, it wasn't just a political shift. It was blasphemy. The king had betrayed God, and a king who defies heaven must face judgment. Damiens was not the only one who believed this, but he was the only one who acted. He watched as France slid further into corruption. He listened as priests debated grace while living in wealth. He saw his daughter go hungry while nobles wagered fortunes on games and lace. He became convinced that nothing short of divine punishment could cleanse the nation. The blade became a symbol, not of death, but of warning. He did not want to start a war. He wanted to strike fear, not into the people, into the court, into the priests, into the king himself. In his mind, one act could unmask the rot. One wound could shake the golden walls of Versailles. And so, in January of 1757, he stopped being a man and became a message. He wrapped the knife carefully, hid it under his coat. His hands trembled. His breath was shallow, but his eyes were steady. He had watched Louis exit the palace before. He knew the carriage, the routine. The guards rarely checked the crowd. He was just another face, another servant, another citizen who would never be noticed, until the moment he stepped forward and plunged the knife toward royalty, not to kill, but to remind France that the divine had eyes. It was cold on the 5th of January, 1757. Paris breathed fog, and the stone streets echoed with wheels and footsteps. Snow had fallen earlier that week and left behind a damp, biting chill that settled in the bones. Robert-François Damiens walked alone. His coat was plain, his shoes worn. No one gave him a second glance. Just another man in the crowd. But beneath his coat, tucked against his side, was a small kitchen knife. The blade wasn't long. The handle was rough. It was not made for murder. It was made for food, for slicing bread or gutting fish. But Damiens had chosen it for something else. He had followed the king's movements for days. He knew Louis would leave the palace of Versailles in the afternoon and travel by carriage to visit his daughter. The guards were always near, but never alert. Louis felt untouchable. The people were expected to bow, not strike. Damiens waited near the gate. He did not speak. He did not pray. He held the knife tight inside his coat, his fingers going numb from the cold. The king stepped out. He wore a thick coat trimmed in fur. His face was tired, his movements slow. He greeted the guards with a nod, then moved toward his carriage. Damiens stepped forward, one stride, then two. He reached the king's side and raised the knife with both hands. The blade barely pierced the skin. It entered near the ribs, through the heavy coat, and left only a shallow wound. Blood began to stain the fabric, but the king did not fall. He turned, stunned, staring at the man who had dared touch him. The guards descended. Damiens was thrown to the ground, the knife torn from his hands. He made no attempt to run. He did not fight back. He was beaten, kicked, dragged away as the crowd screamed. Louis XV was not killed. The blade had glanced off his rib, a minor injury, but the effect was immediate. The King of France had been stabbed by a servant in public, and that was enough. The palace went into lockdown. The Queen was told her husband might be dying. The streets erupted with rumors. Some said it was a Protestant plot. Others blamed the English. A few whispered that Damiens had been possessed. But in the dungeon beneath the conciergerie, Damiens gave no names. No accomplices, no country, no creed, no cause. He simply said that the king had wronged God, and now God had answered. The blade was dull, the wound was shallow. The king did not collapse, nor did he bleed much, but that stab, small as it was, shattered everything. Louis XV had ruled for more than 4 decades. He had faced war, famine, rebellion, and scandal. But never this. Never a hand raised directly against him in the open, in the daylight, in front of his guards. The court reacted not as if he had been wounded, but as if the entire monarchy had been torn open. Panic flooded Versailles. Doctors were called from across Paris. The royal physicians circled the wound, examined the torn coat, touched the king's skin like it was glass. The injury was no deeper than a half-inch. No vital organs had been touched, but the shock had sunk into the royal flesh. The king trembled, not from pain, but from what it meant. He had always been distant from the people. He lived behind golden gates, surrounded by marble, mistresses, and mirrors. He believed himself above the rage that boiled in the streets. Now, that illusion was gone. A man had come within inches of his heart. The guards could say nothing. The ministers fell silent. The queen wept, believing the end had come. And Damiens, still breathing, had been taken alive. That was the choice that changed the rest. They could have killed him on the spot, but they didn't, because they needed more than blood. They needed an answer, a confession, a name. They needed to prove that this was not a crack in the foundation of divine right, but an isolated disease. Damiens gave them nothing. He said he acted alone. He said God had spoken to him. He said the king had betrayed the faith, and that his knife had been a warning, not an execution. But the monarchy could not afford a warning. It needed revenge. What followed was not about justice. It was about making a point, about dragging a man from anonymity to the center of a stage built for agony. He would be interrogated, tortured, humiliated, and then destroyed in public, part by part, under the eyes of 1,000 citizens. Louis XV survived. He walked again. He ate. He ruled. But he was never the same. The cut healed. The wound closed. But the fear stayed open. From that moment on, the king ruled a nation that had watched his blood fall, and the man who had spilled it would pay in ways that no human body should ever endure. The decision came quickly. Damiens would die, but not quietly, not cleanly. His execution would be a message, not just to the man who struck the king, but to anyone who might ever imagine doing the same. Louis XV survived the wound, but the monarchy itself had been pierced. The people had seen it. A servant with no army, no power, no allies had touched the royal flesh. The king wanted more than justice. He wanted a spectacle. The sentence was crafted with precision, drawn from ancient traditions once reserved for traitors, heretics, and demons. It was not a death sentence. It was a sentence of destruction. Damiens was to be taken to the Place de Grève in the heart of Paris. Before the crowd, he would be burned, torn, mutilated, and pulled apart by horses. The punishment was known as drawing and quartering, but this version would go further. First, red-hot pincers would be used to rip flesh from his chest, arms, thighs, and calves. The wounds would then be filled with boiling oil, burning resin, and molten wax. His right hand, the one that held the knife, would be burned off with sulfur. Then, his limbs would be chained to 4 horses. They would pull, again and again, until his body came apart. If the limbs did not separate, the executioners were ordered to help, cutting muscle, tendon, and bone until death finally arrived. The sentence was read publicly. There were no protests, no delays. This was not about Damiens anymore. It was about restoring fear. Across Paris, people whispered. Some felt horror, some felt satisfaction, but all understood the truth. This was going to be something no one had ever seen. Preparations began. The scaffold was reinforced. 4 strong horses were selected and trained. The executioners gathered tools: irons, pincers, chains, sulfur, oil, torches. Damiens remained in the conciergerie, under heavy guard. He was not allowed light, not allowed conversation. His food was barely edible. His clothes were taken. His flesh was already scarred from the early tortures. But he was kept alive. That was the point. He had to live long enough to feel everything. This would be the last public execution of its kind in French history, and it would be remembered not as justice, but as a national ritual of pain, because the king did not want closure. He wanted a warning, carved into memory, and Damiens would be the man they carved. The execution had been planned. The crowd would be massive. The punishment had been approved by the king himself. But before any rope was tied to a horse, Robert-François Damiens would be tortured behind stone walls. Not to punish him, not to kill him, but to prepare him. They needed him alive. They needed him conscious, but they wanted him broken. Inside the conciergerie, time stopped. Damiens no longer lived by day or night. His cell was dark. Cold water was thrown on him without warning. He was beaten, cut, starved, left naked in filth. And every few hours, they came with questions. Who helped you? Was it England? Was it the Protestants? Was it the Jesuits? Was it a secret army? He gave the same answer. No one helped. There was no plot. He acted alone. He stabbed the king because the king had betrayed God. That answer wasn't enough. They began the formal interrogations. Damiens was tied to a wooden board, his arms and legs stretched. Hot irons pressed against his thighs. His skin burned. The scent of seared flesh filled the chamber. They placed sulfur and oil near open wounds and lit them. The mixture hissed. His flesh bubbled. Still, he said nothing new. He screamed, but the guards did not flinch. They were instructed to ignore it. No mercy, no pause. For days they continued. A surgeon examined him between sessions, not to treat him, but to make sure he wouldn't die too early. They wanted the body intact for the final act. One night, a jailer reported hearing him talk to himself, not babble, not madness, but calm, whispered prayers. He believed he was still right, that France had fallen from grace, that he had delivered judgment, that the fire was his trial, and if he survived it long enough, he would be saved. There was no repentance, no tears, only pain and faith, twisted, unshaken faith. By the fourth day, his legs were swollen and blackened. His back was a map of raw flesh. His right hand, burned down to layers of blistered skin, barely functioned. But his heart still beat, and his mouth still worked. They stopped the torture only because the day of execution had arrived. The crowd was ready. The square was being prepared. The horses had arrived. The tools were cleaned. They dragged Damiens from the cell. He could not walk. They carried him. He was not a man anymore. He was something else, a symbol, a warning, a body meant for pain. And soon the people would watch it all unfold, not in secret, but in the open, where thousands would stand and see exactly what happens when a servant touches the crown. By morning, the Place de Grève was full. Word had spread for days. The man who stabbed the king would be executed in the square. Not just killed. Torn, burned, pulled apart. Thousands came. From the city, from nearby towns, from miles away. Some brought children. Others brought food. They stood shoulder to shoulder, pressed against the wooden barriers. Windows overlooking the square were rented out for gold. Everyone wanted to witness it. Everyone thought they were ready. In the center of the square stood the scaffold. Thick beams, iron rings, heavy ropes. Buckets of oil sat near the platform. Chains lay coiled beside a row of tools. 4 horses, large and restless, stood tied to posts. The air smelled of sweat, cold wind, and hot metal. Then they brought him out. Robert-François Damiens no longer looked like a man. His skin hung in tatters. His legs were barely functional. His eyes were open, but distant. One arm hung limp. The other was strapped to his body. They dragged him forward. He stumbled, then collapsed. Guards pulled him to his feet. The crowd fell silent. He was stripped naked. The cold hit his body like a final insult. Every scar from the past week was visible. They began with the red-hot pincers. Executioners stepped forward, pressing iron against his chest. Flesh tore away. Blood poured. Then again, the thighs, the arms, the calves. One by one, The pincers ripped meat from his bones. He screamed. The sound was not human, not sharp. It was long, wet, echoing. They poured boiling oil into the wounds, then molten wax, then melted lead. It hissed. Smoke rose. He howled again, shaking in his restraints. Then they burned his right hand with flaming sulfur, the hand that held the knife. It shriveled, blackened, and peeled. The crowd shifted. Some cheered. Some were silent. A few turned away. The front row saw everything. Blood, steam, burned skin. Then came the horses. His limbs were tied, wrists and ankles pulled in 4 directions. The ropes were tightened. The platform cleared. At a signal, the horses moved. First slowly, then faster. The ropes stretched. Muscles tensed. Skin began to pull. Bones resisted. His body arched unnaturally. He screamed again. One arm tore at the socket. The left leg began to split. Blood spilled down the wood. And still, he lived. The horses stopped. The crowd waited. The executioners consulted. It was not enough. They brought out knives, hacked to the joints, sliced at the tendons. Then, the horses pulled again, and the limbs finally gave way. One leg, one arm, then the others. The crowd had seen violence before, but not like this. This was not punishment. It was disassembly, piece by piece, and the screaming had not stopped. The Place de Grève was silent, but not still. People shifted. Faces turned pale. Men clenched their jaws. Women held cloths over their noses. The smell had changed. It wasn't just blood anymore. It was something else. Burned skin, boiled flesh, waste. A sour, thick odor that drifted over the crowd like smoke from a battlefield. Some had come expecting a spectacle. Others wanted justice, but few expected this. The crowd had seen the pincers. They had seen the boiling oil and the fire. They had watched the limbs stretch and snap. But it wasn't the pain that broke them. It was the time. It would not end. Most executions were fast. One stroke of the blade, a drop from the rope. Even burnings eventually gave into flame. But this was slow. Damiens was still alive. He had no arms, no legs. His chest had collapsed in places. His skin had been carved away. His mouth opened but made no sound. Only small gasps, shuddering breaths. The horses stood still, foaming and panting, their legs trembling with the weight of what they had done. The executioners looked at each other, uncertain. This was not a performance anymore. This was a problem. They had orders to continue. The king's court demanded every detail of the sentence be carried out fully. No shortcuts, no mercy. But Damiens refused to die. People began to leave. Not many, but enough to be noticed. A few fainted. A few vomited. One man dropped to his knees, crossed himself, and prayed for the end. Children screamed. Women wept. A priest stepped forward, offering last rites, but Damiens could not respond. His eyes were open, but blank. His body barely moved. He was alive, but unreachable. The executioners picked up knives again. They approached what remained, cut deeper, opened the chest, tried to reach the heart. They tore at sinew and muscle, whispering to each other, asking if they should stop. But they couldn't stop, not until it was done, not until the man was gone. Eventually, one of them leaned close, placed a hand over Damiens' mouth. No breath, no sound. It was over. The crowd stood in stunned silence. There was no cheer, no satisfaction, just the sound of the horses snorting, the crackle of a torch, the soft thud of something falling to the scaffold floor. A nobleman near the edge of the square whispered to his wife, "We have broken something today. Not just a man, something deeper." And though Damiens was dead, the memory of that moment had only just begun to burn. His heart had stopped, but the nightmare continued. Damiens' corpse lay in pieces, twisted and blood-soaked, the skin in strips, the limbs half attached by ruined flesh and bone. He was no longer recognizable. The man who once served nobles, who once carried trays and opened doors, was now a mass of red and black, spread across the scaffold like a butchered animal. But even after death, he would not be granted peace. The sentence demanded more. His body had to be destroyed completely. There could be no grave, no monument, no relic. Guards stepped forward and began collecting the remains. Some parts were scooped into buckets. Others dragged off the platform like trash. His torso, the largest piece left, was dumped onto a fresh pile of firewood. A fire was lit. The flames took quickly. Oil was poured over the flesh. The fat crackled. The skin blistered again. His face, already unrecognizable, turned to ash. Smoke rose into the gray Parisian sky. It carried with it the final part of him, the sound of burning meat mixed with the snapping of bone. The stench became unbearable. Even from the far edge of the square, people covered their mouths and turned away. There was no ceremony, no priest, no final word. What had once been Damiens was now smoke. The ashes were scattered in secret. The king's orders were clear. Not a trace must remain. And that was not the end. The court had one more demand. His family, his name, everything connected to him had to be erased. His home in Arras was demolished. His wife and daughter were forced to change their names. His relatives were threatened, watched, and banished. He had stabbed the king, and in return, France erased him. But the problem was not solved. No matter how completely his body was destroyed, no matter how deep the ashes were buried, the image remained. People could not forget what they had seen. They dreamed of his screams. They remembered the smell. They remembered the silence when the crowd realized the man on the scaffold was still alive with no limbs left to scream. Damiens had wanted to send a message. He believed France had turned against God. In the end, it was France that gave the message, loud, bloody, unforgiving. Touch the king, and suffer a death that will haunt the living. Even those who looked away remembered. And long after the scaffold was cleaned and the fire turned cold, the whispers remained about the man who would not die, and the country that made sure he never lived again. By the time the blood had dried and the ashes cooled, France had already begun to forget his name. There would be no statue, no grave, no plaque on the scaffold where he died. There would be no sermon for his soul, no story passed down by proud descendants. His life had ended, and then his memory was dragged down with it. But forgetting him completely was impossible. What happened on January 28, 1757, could not be erased. The people of Paris carried it with them. The ones who had stood in the square, who had seen skin torn from bone and heard hours of screaming, left changed. They spoke less. They dreamed more. Children who saw it woke crying for weeks. Adults who had once cheered for harsh punishments found themselves sick with guilt. Soldiers returned to the barracks in silence. Priests avoided mentioning it in confession. Even in Versailles, the opulence felt thinner. The king had been avenged. But what did it cost? Robert-François Damiens had not started a revolution. He had not tried to bring down the monarchy. He had not even tried to kill the king. He was a solitary man, filled with bitterness and religious fervor, who used a dull knife to send a message. That message was drowned in blood. The punishment had been meant to terrify, and it did, but not in the way they expected. It didn't restore faith. It didn't unite the country. It didn't silence rebellion. Instead, it left behind a deeper fear. A fear that something inside France was broken, that a man could be destroyed piece by piece, and the world would cheer until the cheering stopped. And that fear grew. Years later, the revolution would come. Heads would fall, not in private, but on public squares. The people who had once watched Damiens burn would watch kings and queens meet the blade, and many would remember the day they stood in the cold and watched a servant become a spectacle. They would remember the silence that followed, and they would know that what happened to Damiens wasn't justice. It was a warning, but not to the people, to the crown. If you came this far, make sure to click the next video that's on the screen right now. Subscribe to stay engaged for more content.